countdown to the last comic shop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, it is now time for more of the last comic shop,
where we open the shop up to newbies in order to help them find the way under the comic book tent.
And we keep the lights on for the oldies to help them level up by, reading and talking about comic books.
Yeah, because it's important. I'm the host with the most, Andy Larson, and I'm joined by J.A. Scott and Chad Smith. And on today's program, we've got one of the titans of the comic book industry, Jack the King Kirby. We're actually going to be doing one of his series in... Some people think it's like the linchpin of his whole fourth world thing that he had going on when he left Marvel and he went to DC in the early 70s, and that is New Gods.
That's right. You may have noticed it's a new beginning for the show today. And so why not bring on some New Gods as well?
That's true. If you like the new beginning, by the way, leave us some comments. We want to hear what you think. It's not going anywhere. These guys fought me on putting that.
I want more explosions.
That's right.
Pew sounds,
laser beams. Cars. It's all good. It's similar to this week's book, where it harkens back to the epicness of the cosmos and something like that.
Epic sounds of comics.
Hello, here's a kitty cat.
But in any case, on today's program, again, we're talking about New Gods. It's one of 4 books that Jack Kirby did when he jumped ship from Marvel in the late 60s into the early 70s. As a result of kind of a little bit of a falling out with his creative partner, Stan Lee. For those folks that may not know the story, I think there was a lot of different little moments during his time at Marvel, which probably added up to it. But the big one everybody talks about is, I guess, Stan Lee did an interview with a magazine, and the guy basically said that Stan Lee had created everything. And Jack Kirby took great offense to that, and rightfully so, because he was a co-creator, co-plotter, and under the Marvel method, Jack Kirby had a lot to do with the creation of so many iconic Marvel characters that we all know and love.
And not only did they not give Kirby credit, but they also described him as this workman, foreman in a factory. It was not complimentary. And I think that was one of the final straws.
Yeah. But for those folks that may not know, New Gods was actually a story that Jack Kirby was going to do during his run on The Mighty Thor. As you might have guessed, the notion of there being old gods and new gods actually is wrapped up in the notion of Ragnarok and the rebirth. And so basically, if you read his run on The Mighty Thor, eventually he was going to have all the Asgardians die or whatever, and big giant Ragnarok, and he was going to bring in the new gods, folks like Orion and these folks. So these were all supposed to be, in some way, shape, or form, Marvel characters that he took over to DC. And again, with New Gods and Mr. Miracle and the Forever People
and Jimmy Olsen. Darkseid's first appearance is in Jimmy Olsen.
It's really weird, but that makes up his fourth world saga, which has become a linchpin of DC continuity. Without this, you don't have one of the major baddies of the entire DC universe at this time in Darkseid. You don't have that. And so, guys, I know that I've kind of talked a lot about Jack Kirby's influence on not only Marvel, but on DC in this particular series. What are your particular thoughts of Jack the King Kirby? We'll start with J.A.
Well, I mean, I loved his stuff at Marvel, his early stuff. Obviously, he and Stan were integral in creating Galactus and the Silver Surfer, and that 3-issue run in Fantastic Four, 48, 49, and 50 is just spectacular. From the Kirby art to the Stan writing, it was, a heavyweight comic book team putting out phenomenal work. I think probably that's almost got to be the high point of his career, I would say. He's done a lot of other stuff since then that's been great, but that was, to me, the high point. later on in his life, because of how he was mistreated at Marvel, and then going to DC led him to request things that were not necessarily good for his legacy, but probably good for him himself in terms of like wanting that control. We'll get into this in New Gods a bit. I think he needs an editor. He's really good at some things and not so good at other things. Everyone is prone to bombast sometimes and feeling that they're better than they are. Look at Stan Lee's got that horrible NHL Guardians project, whatever that thing was called.
And Ravage, don't forget Ravage 2099.
Yeah, plenty of bad things have come, from Stan Lee when overreach. So I feel like we need to talk about the Kirby Chrome, the Tops stuff he did at the end, the Kirby verse. Just great first issue with bombast, where you've got a guy throwing a missile at the screen.
Yeah, for me, as far as Jack Kirby goes, I really have come to Jack Kirby kind of secondhand. As when I started reading books, it was in the 90s, and I had all those people that had learned from Kirby and taken ideas from Kirby and, melded a lot of those things. And so it wasn't until much later did I go back and find out, how important he was and how great his stories were. And for me, I've always been a Spider-Man guy. And even if I'm going to read older comics, dating back to the 60s, I love the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, Spider-Man stuff. And so it wasn't until I picked up Kirby's Fantastic Four run and started reading some of that. I feel like the first couple issues weren't my scene, but after around issue 20 or so, like Fantastic Four just picks up and doesn't stop. It's, huge idea after huge idea after huge idea. And so reading through that was really exciting. And since then, as I've learned about the comic book industry, I go back to the comic book history of comics, which Jack Kirby was the main character in the comic book history of comics because he had done so much, whether it was creating Captain America for Marvel or working on Shazam or creating Green Arrow, or then going back to Marvel for the Fantastic Four with Stan Lee, everything they were able to create and accomplish there, whether it was going to DC, and then after he's done with DC, going back to Marvel and doing a really celebrated Captain America run. It's taken me a while to appreciate Jack Kirby. It's hard to undersell how important he is to the industry. And just there's so many ideas. And we'll talk about that with New Gods. So many ideas and so many things that happen in comics that don't happen if you don't have a Jack Kirby.
Yeah, I'm going to echo both of your sentiments in the fact that, I've always been a big fan of Jack Kirby. I've enjoyed his art since I was a little kid. I've often talked on other shows about how one of my favorite runs of all time is like the first 8 issues of the original Avengers, which are the ones that Jack Kirby drew. Like eventually Don Heck takes over that series and it's pretty good, but it's the ones that Jack Kirby did when he's introducing, the Masters of Evil or Kang the Conqueror and his love of purple and green villains. It's just wonderful. And I mean, come on. He was the guy that created Dr. Doom. He's the guy that created Machine Man. He's the guy that created one of the folks I will be recommending later in the show, Devil Dinosaur. These are all characters that I just love. Among the tops of all the characters that exist in comics, even Captain America. We talked about it on the Captain America show. Without, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon doing that series, you don't have one of the linchpins of the Marvel Universe. In fact, you don't have the Marvel Universe at all if you don't have Jack Kirby. So you just, but at the same time, I think to J.A.'s point, there's things that Jack Kirby does well, and there are things that Jack Kirby does not do well. And I feel like on this particular program, I'm not going to be one of these guys that is afraid to say the Emperor has no clothes at certain points. With Jack Kirby's mythology and legacy. There's some things he probably was best to stay away from, or at least have somebody helping him out. But we'll get to that right after these commercial breaks. We'll finally get into our review of New God. So stay tuned for that.
Hey everybody, this is Nerd Bomber here, one of the co-hosts of the Online Warriors podcast. Our weekly podcast started as a way for three friends to keep in touch and discuss their passion for movies, gaming, technology, and entertainment. And since then, we've grown into a fantastic online community. Every Wednesday, we release a new episode discussing the latest nerdy news, and then we go hands-on with our weekly adventures and a fun trivia show. Sound interesting? Check us out on every podcast platform, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or hit us up at onlinewarriorspodcast.com.
Looking for a podcast all about nerddom?
Want a podcast with an emphasis on representation?
The Nerd Alternative is the podcast for you. Join me, Ram.
Me, Hassan.
And me, Levi.
Three black British nerds tackling the pop culture we love and sharing why we love them. The Nerd Alternative, a sweet melting pot of all things nerdy.
All right, we're back with more of The Last Comic Shop, and it is now time for us to dissect the series known as The New Gods by Jack the King Kirby. And I will say that recently there was a tremendous trade that was put out. It's what I'm using as the basis for my review. They also did a Mr. Miracle version as well. I'm not sure if they came out with one, the Forever People, but it is a wonderful trade that you can collect that not only gives you all 11 issues of the New God series before it was canceled, as well as Hunger Dogs, which was a original graphic novel that was put out by Jack Kirby in the early 80s that was supposed to, quote unquote, wrap all of the New Gods up, even though they really wouldn't let him because they needed the characters. But Chad, who helped Jack Kirby do New Gods?
Most of it, the lion's share is Jack Kirby, as he was the writer, he was the artist, he was the editor. He had inking assists from Vince Coletta. Mike Royer did a lot of great work. D. Bruce Berry helped out on The Hunger Gods along with Greg Theakston.
Okay. And J.A., since this was your pick, do you want to do the 10-cent synopsis?
Yeah, nice how it's my pick. Basically, I said, I want to do a DC book, guys. Do you have any suggestions? Oh, New Gods, New Gods. So suddenly it's New Gods is my choice, foisted on me. But, hey, it's Jack Kirby. It's going to be great.
I was really excited you picked New Gods. Thanks, dude.
I'm glad I picked it, too. So basically, this is the original 11-issue run is an introduction to two planets of New Gods, New Genesis and Apocalypse. Most people probably know Apocalypse from the Superman's book. They are two planets that are polar opposites of each other, and they're in a war with each other. But this isn't a real war. It's like a WrestleMania war. Where we'll send one person against one person, because why fight a war when you can just have lots of one-offs? And then halfway through, there's like rival gangs of humans on Earth, which I just didn't get. And it's not like they're gang members. Their gangs are filled up with like accountants.
And insurance folks?
And insurance salesmen.
Insurance executive, yes.
Yes. And then, of course, there are all these different New God characters. Obviously, we've got Darkseid, of course, is the big one. Orion, the son of Darkseid. You get all of the people from Apocalypse that we know and love today, like Granny Goodness and Darkseid and Steppenwolf. On the other side of things, you get people like Mr. Miracle and Light Ray.
Shut up, Light Ray. Sorry, that's a throwback to the Tom King series that came out 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
And a whole bunch of other people that levitate and move around the universe with the help of stupid stuff like skis or exercise bikes.
So it's okay that he's silver and he has a surfboard, but when you're, skis, that's different. No, we can't abide by that being.
Surfboards work, skis not so much. You know why?
Oh.
Because you need poles.
He had poles?
So he can't do anything with his hands because he's got to keep poling. And here's my question. If you've got skis, okay, I get it if you're going downhill, but what if you're going cross-country? Does that mean he's got to, cross-country ski across the sky?
Oh, cross-country skiing is the worst.
This is kind of a hodgepodge. of ideas. And one of the things we were talking about before the show was, in addition to this series, I've also read Mr. Miracle. And I like Mr. Miracle a lot more than New Gods. And it's primarily because I feel like Mr. Miracle is much more focused, or at least harkens back to things that Jack Kirby did at Marvel really well. When you read the Mr. Miracle series, you get the main character of Scott Free, Mr. Miracle. You get his partner in Big Barda. You get his, other partner in Oberon. And then every single issue, they just kind of wheel out another member of his rogues gallery who he defeats by the end of the issue. So it's like kind of like Spider-Man, or Fantastic Four.
But here's the kicker. And I agree with you. I recently, after we finished this, I read some Mr. Miracle too. And I think the biggest difference is Mr. Miracle has Oberon and he has Big Barda. Legend has it that Big Barda was based off of Jack Kirby's wife, Roz. I think because it was based on his wife, it had a little bit more heart to it. The more I thought about New Gods is a war story. And it's not so much about the heart or the character as much as it is about this incomprehensible war between these two sides and insurance executives.
Yes.
And alley lurking Darkseids.
I like the fact that you use the word incomprehensible because at times
I couldn't understand why these super, super powerful beings were using humans as pawns. I get it, but it was. Is that an allegory to like Vietnam? I don't know. I mean, it didn't work for me, and I think this shows how hard it can be to do really good world building sometimes. And you look at sort of the Marvel universe, it wasn't built from whole cloth. It was built slowly over time. You introduce one book, then you introduce another book, then you introduce another book, and then you start to bring these books together and have this shared universe. Instead, this felt much more like what Image did in the early 90s, where they just threw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall. Let's do it all! And then, Youngblood not so well, but Spawn kind of stuck. Savage Dragon kind of stuck.
Yeah,
so
who do you think inspired all those Image guys? Jack Kirby.
When I was reading this, that's what I felt. This is like the Jack Kirby Image. And then, you get some good ideas that stuck and some bad ideas like Orion that thankfully didn't stick. Because, he's got some interesting ideas, but he just, I don't know, the fact that he needs all these accoutrements to do anything.
Well, I will say this. I kept on snickering every single time. He was like, I got to ride on the Astroglide. I was like, oh, come on now. You got to slick yourself.
You know what it reminded me of? Like, oh, here comes Chuck Norris in his Total Gym again.
It's just, but that's the thing. To the point where it was like this was supposed to be a war story. He couldn't decide on exactly which part of the war he wanted to talk about. At the beginning, it's like Darkseid has infiltrated the Earth and has like agents or whatever. Oh, we got to figure out who the agents are. Here comes these Deep Six people that are mutating sea monsters. Okay, we'll spend a couple issues there. Then we'll tell the origin of the New Gods like halfway through the story, which is like, why wasn't that issue 1? Like, I don't get that. And then we'll go back and we'll talk about Caliban, who's a kind of a cool character, and him fighting Orion. And then there's an issue where, like, there's a police commissioner or a police detective.
Terrible Turpin.
Why is that issue there?
That was Daredevil fighting Namor. It was great.
It was something. I don't know if it was great. I think the best panel in that is like classic Jack Kirby jump. He's holding like some sort of blaster machine gun. And I'm like, who is this dude? Why isn't he a superhero? Like, he seems like a cross between Nick Fury and J. Jonah Jameson. Like, you can defend it, Chad, but it was a bunch of ideas thrown in the blender, and gosh knows what came out.
I will defend it, and I also totally agree. One, I think this does harken back to, how comics were made, and that I'm not sure the New Gods was a really well thought out plan as far as pacing goes. I just think he would do an issue, and then he would do another issue, and then whatever, let's do this now. And I won't lie, this was tough for me to read. Like, reading modern comics and going back to this, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Like, it was a challenge. But the whole thing about Jack Kirby is, at least in my mind, he is an idea factory. As he's building this universe from the ground up, and he has things like mother boxes. We talked about the Black Racer, who's this Vietnam vet who, can't walk. He's a paraplegic. Now he becomes the Black Racer. You get Metron in the Mobius chair. You get Darkseid. You get Victor Lanza, insurance executive. You get the classic comic thing where they introduce characters like, and I'm Sally, what's her name? And I don't know what I'm doing here. The uniform, the wall with the little hand that writes and gives advice. The High Father. You get Terrible Turpin. You get Calabac. Boom Tubes. And some of it is biblical in nature, like the whole thing with the High Father and Darkseid, and they trade their sons. Like, that's crazy pants, but it's just like a story out of the Bible. Except not. But this takes place, in that Vietnam era, and you have Jack Kirby, who's this World War II vet, and that's what I think the New Gods was about, as opposed to Mr. Miracle, that was more about his relationship, or it had that Roz factor in there. This was more about Jack Kirby coming to grips with the fact that he wanted to be a pacifist, but at the same time, he was a World War II vet who had seen some stuff. And so when you get to the character of Orion, where Orion puts on this pretty face, but underneath, he has hairy eyebrows. And even in that story, that we mentioned the Glory Boat, where they have the father and the son is the pacifist guy, and the father's all gung ho on action. Even at some point, the pacifist gets in and starts fighting. And I think that was Jack Kirby trying to come to grips with that whole Vietnam era, where it's like
generational divide too. That's why I think the father and son works, and that's the high point of this book. I think that issue 6, issue 7, both from an artistic standpoint, but also from a writing standpoint. We mentioned it earlier. I think the biggest problem with this series was that it was just too much Kirby. They needed an outside voice. He needed an editor. They could have smoothed in some of these areas, made it a bit more streamlined and well put together. Some of, as we said, it's really 60s comic book writing. Came out in the 70s, but it's really 60s, classic Silver Age comic book writing. It's each one of these issues is 48 pages long of like 6 to 8 panels per page. It's a novel.
So we talked a little bit about Orion, and ultimately Orion wants to sacrifice himself, for New Genesis. He's going to do all these barbaric things, but it's in service of the greater good. You have that in contrast to Light Ray, who we talked about the generational stuff. He's like your naive, but also he's very understanding. Light Ray is. I like that. But looking through that lens of Kirby coming to grips with living in a Vietnam era, being a vet, but wanting peace and trying to corral those two ideas. I thought that part was interesting. But to J.A.'s point, there's a reason why the best Kirby stuff is made with collaborators, with people like Stan Lee or Joe Simon. Yeah. Sometimes we all need somebody to rein us in, and you can tell where he goes off the rails. But at the same time, there's so much here. There's so much spectacle. There's so much great Jack Kirby art. Those 2-page spreads are just insane. One with the god who's strapped to a meteor shooting through space. That is batshit crazy. The collages. There's so much here. My favorite sitcoms, they talk about the joke to minute ratio. The idea to panel ratio in these New Gods books. It's just outstanding. It's astonishing how much he's able to cram in. And even though this was a bumpy ride, think about how much DC has coasted off this stuff ever since.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get to this again. When he did Hunger Dogs towards the end, he wanted to kill all these characters. He wanted to kill all the New Gods. He wanted to destroy this and basically bring his story to an end. And then DC said, no. Darkseid is now our major bad guy on the Super Friends. You're not getting rid of them. That's not what we want. We need to use these guys for other means here, and rightfully so. Again, Darkseid is, other than probably Lex Luthor and Joker, among like the number one villains that DC has. And in fact,
for DC Universe, he's their Doctor Doom. He's the guy who fights everybody.
And if it hadn't been for Darkseid, then you wouldn't have had Thanos, because basically Jim Starlin in issue 55 of Iron Man was like, I got to come up with a villain for one issue. Originally drew Metron, or somebody that looked like Metron, and then his editor said, well, if you're going to rip off one of the new gods, at least rip off Darkseid. He drew him as kind of looking more like Darkseid, and we got Thanos. And Thanos is now, again, thanks to the MCU, arguably more important to the Marvel Universe than Doctor Doom at this point, because more people know who Thanos is. But no, yes. I will say this, that to J.A.'s point about world building and how hard it is, the good thing about New Gods is that there is one issue, at least for me, that stands out a bunch among the rest. You mentioned issue 6. I think from a maybe a narrative perspective and an artistic perspective, yeah, I can agree that one's really good. But the best issue of this series is issue 7, which just tells you the whole backstory of the deal between Highfather and Darkseid, how the war started, how Darkseid had manipulated events from the beginning, got Steppenwolf to kill Highfather's wife just so that he could eventually seize power down the line. And if you want to talk about world building, I could have read that issue of New Gods and nothing else and thought Kirby was a genius, because that issue was succinct. It told a good story from beginning to end. And by the end of it, I was like, I cared about all of the characters. It had a point. It almost felt like biblical at times. Like it told a very relatable story. The rest of the series is just a bunch of fights with a bunch of people that are running around and women saying, oh, look at Orion. I can tame that savage beast. Where's Orion going? And I'm just like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't. And maybe that's just me, but like issue 7, God, that was wonderful.
And it exists off of Earth, talking about these cosmic, epic storylines, and so you don't put it on Earth with insurance salesmen. That helps.
Your Darkseid lurking in an alley was a weird thing. I was not ready for that.
Right. It harkens back to all the great stuff Kirby was doing at Marvel just previously. We talked about issues 48 through 50 of the Fantastic Four, but also people forget about the great stuff he was doing with the Mighty Thor, introducing characters like the High Evolutionary, and eventually Thor teams up with Ego the Living Planet to stop Galactus. That all works because it's kind of like that cosmic side of stuff. And he actually does that really well. It's like all this other stuff. Like, I don't know. He just doesn't do that as well.
And I think you had mentioned, Chad, that a lot of these stories and ideas were meant to, I'm going to create it, and then somebody else runs with it. So I'll be like the big world beater, and then I'll just kind of edit these things and be the creative puppet master. But other people were meant to take over some of these books, and I think it didn't happen that way.
Yeah, eventually it did. There's some great people that eventually stepped in and wrote some stuff. I think Jerry Conway eventually wrote The Return of the New Gods in the late 70s. Steve Englehart eventually ended up on Mr. Miracle and gave us some good issues, as well as Steve Gerber ended up on Mr. Miracle for a little while, which was kind of neat. If you can ever track down those issues that Steve Gerber did on Mr. Miracle, they're pretty good. Before we go to commercial break, the last thing I wanted to ask you is, what did you think of Hunger Dogs, which again was released like a good decade after this original 11-issue run of New Gods, and bringing Jack Kirby back to kind of wrap up his story? I honestly thought it was the weakest part of this entire series. I think they were kept on talking about the micro mark, and I was like, I don't know what that is. Like, right. It's not very thought out very well. And evidently there was a lot of, again, he wanted to kill all the characters, and he had to go back into rewrites like 1,000 times to eventually get to where we got. But what are your thoughts on that one?
I agree. It was the weakest of the output there. But it helped after I went back and read some Mr. Miracle afterwards and saw some of the Hyman stuff, which made his character make a little bit more sense. But yeah, I think you got the Hunger Dogs was more at the end of Jack Kirby's run as an effective artist. And just reading some of the stuff I've read about Jack Kirby, I know it's like his eyesight was starting to go, and it's definitely a lesser product, only because it took a decade plus to happen. All that energy, it sort of dissipated, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's the age-old saying is that you should never go back. It's never as good as it was the first time. You can never recapture that spark. I just think it was sort of something that, not unlike New Gods, to me, it was foisted on him. And then he was not allowed to do what he wanted to do with it as well. So he was constrained, and I think that shows both in the storytelling and, his later on in his life, the art doesn't hold up as well.
The inkers aren't as good, and like a lot of that manic energy just isn't there.
Yeah, it's missing the Kirby crackle.
It's weird how like his original idea for New Gods, either whether it was in the original series or with this Hunger Dogs, was to like kill all the New Gods characters. Like, honestly, they only existed in terms of comic books like a microsecond. Like, these are like 10 issues and you already want to kill these characters? Like, we haven't even had a chance to breathe with most of these characters. So, like, I don't know why he was like, yeah, let's just kill him. Let's get rid of him. Like, I actually agree with DC to be like, no, hold on here. Like, we've barely scratched the surface with some of these folks. Let other folks kind of work with these people, I guess.
What are you talking about? He's Jack Kirby, created 100 characters like this. He can create 100 more. Tell your batshit baloney crazy story and kill them all and then move on to the next group.
I am going to ask you, Chad, how New Gods compares to Commandy.
Oh, that's tough.
But we'll get to that right after these commercial breaks. So stay tuned for more of The Last Comic Shop. We'll have our rating. We're actually going to rate Jack Kirby's work. So stay tuned for that. I wonder how many people will piss off.
A lot.
Need a podcast talking about weird stuff? Well, then of them all, Dr. Stephen Strange, then this is the show for you.
ITW's on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and TuneIn. Hit subscribe and join us for a comic-filled jaunt into the weird.
All right, we're back with more of The Last Comic Shop, and it is now time for our ratings, where we have the absolute audacity to piss off so many comic book fans throughout time and space by saying, hey, we're going to be somewhat critical of Jack Kirby's work on at least New Gods. Now, and I won't say there's plenty of Jack Kirby I love. Again, I love Machine Man. I love Fantastic Four. I love the Avengers. I love all kinds of stuff he created. I'm not sure I love New Gods, but we'll get to that in a second. We've got J.A. He's going to give us our rating scale for the New Gods. And what is that rating scale, J.A.?
I can't wait to hear this sound effect. 1 out of 4 Kirby crackles.
Ooh! Well, there it was. We'll go ahead and start off with you, J.A., since it is your book. It was your
All right.
pick this
Yes,
week.
yes.
Just make
It
sure
was
that everybody
foisted on me.
knows.
My book. That's the last time I say, well, gee, I want to read something DC. Do you guys have any suggestions? Well, we should read this because then it's not my pick. It's your pick. I've got to give it two Kirby Crackles. It's just too much stuff. You gotta wade through all the insurance salesmen and gods hiding in back alleys instead of acting like gods to get to the good stuff. And when you get to the good stuff, it's really, really good. Some of those panels are masterpieces. They belong hanging up in a museum. But in between, there's just some really dry writing, bad editing decisions. It's something I feel that has been held up as one of these great events by people who sort of, are looking at the past with rose-tinted glasses.
Hi. Chad, how many Kirby Crackles you giving it?
Okay, well, considering it from the historical context and wanting to hold it up with rose-tinted glasses, I would say a 4. But then I actually read it, and that was hard. So then I would say a 2. And then I'm like, okay, it has to be somewhere in between. And there were those moments of just sheer genius. But there's also a lot of incomprehensible gobbledygook as well. And so I'm going to say 2.5 Kirby Crackles at the end of the day for the New Gods run, which ends with issue 11 with Orion being like, once I get to Darkseid, this will be over. And then that doesn't happen for a decade.
And when it does happen, you get Hunger Dogs. Sounds like a really bad fast food chain for Frankfurters.
Right.
Come down to Hungry Dogs, where you can get them with extra relish, onions, and all the works.
Now, hot dog shop aside, for the historical context, I think this is super important. But man, it's hard. It's hard to read. I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, you're right. It's hard for me to say it, but again, I told you at the beginning of the show, I'm going to have moments where I say the Emperor has no clothes. And with New Gods, Jack Kirby has no clothes with this. I think this is a 1.5. It's not even a 2. It's below that. And it's unfortunate because there was only really one issue I really loved. It was issue 7. But if you give me almost 400 pages worth of comic books and you tell me there's one good one, I'm sorry. I call it how I see it. And I'm like, that's not a good series. That's a good issue. And maybe those are tremendous and belong up on the pedestal with other Jack Kirby work that I think is really good. But I've read a lot of Jack Kirby, and this is not his best work by a long shot. Mr. Miracle is better than this. Machine Man's better than this. Devil Dinosaur, which will be my recommendation in just a few seconds, is better than this. Commandy is better than this. Fantastic Four, Avengers, his Mighty Thor run is the best. That's one of the best books that Kirby ever wrote and co-plotted and all that stuff. Go read that. Don't read New Gods. Look at it for some pretty pictures. Don't read it. Read issue 7 maybe if you need to have some sort of backstory and what happens with the New Gods. Everything else is, I don't know, it's just stuff. And so, yeah, it's a 1.5 because there's better stuff out there if you want to read good Kirby. Don't waste your time on this. That's just my take. And you can find some of that better Kirby at your local comic book store with the other of our recommendations.
Yep, so that's where we recommend something similar, something recent, and something a little bit out of left field that you can hopefully pick up at your local comic book shop, be it in trade or in the buck bin. And what do we got this week for something similar?
Well, as I mentioned previously, I wanted to talk about Devil Dinosaur because I just love that series that Jack Kirby put out at Marvel in the mid-'70s. Similar to New Gods in that it only had a very limited run. It only ran for 9 issues. But unlike New Gods, it takes a really crazy, wonky concept of this red dinosaur that runs around like some prehistoric place with a monkey sidekick on his back, beating up alien colonists, and I don't know, giant mutant ants and big other monsters. Like, it not only does it have some of that wonderful Jack Kirby 2-page spread stuff. I mean, there's a cool 2-page panel in issue 4, which it kind of looks like it came out of somebody's 70s college dorm room with like just Kirby dots everywhere. Put a black light on it. It just looks wonderful. But the reason why Devil Dinosaur works so well is because it boils down this weird, crazy concept into something very simple. Devil Dinosaur plays out like somebody watching professional wrestling. That's all it is. Whether you watch professional wrestling in your life, or maybe you've watched the Rocky movies or boxing or wrestling stories, take your choice. But it's really like just the story of a big red dinosaur who basically fights everything who dares to question his rule in this weird little valley, like he's the world champion. And he's got the belt around his waist, and most of the time his fights just involve stomping or kicking or giving the big boots to his opponents like some sort of finishing move. And he's, at all times he's got Moon Boy, who's kind of like his valet or his manager or whatever. He kind of like sits there, he talks a lot of smack for the two of them, he pumps them up. He's like, oh, go get him, Devil, you can beat him, Devil, crush his enemies, and things like that. And afterwards he makes sure that he's fed and well-bathed and prepped for his next fight against a random Triceratops or a giant Bigfoot kind of creation. For 9 issues, it kind of goes on like that. And, it's just a setup for the next fight and the next fight and the next fight. So if you like Godzilla movies, read Devil Dinosaur, because it's like the comic book version of that. It's even better than the actual comic book version of Godzilla. So, yeah, you should check it out.
I'm just imagining Devil Dinosaur trying to buckle the belt. With the small arms.
That's why he's got Moon Boy. He
opposable thumbs.
All right, I'll go next. My pick is going to be the Something Current, and this is something that came out circa 2019. I actually picked it up mid-pandemic. I went into my comic shop and I was like, I need something to buy to help my comic shop out, because they weren't putting new books out at the time, and I found Deceased by Tom Taylor, and Trevor Hersine was the main artist. And basically what happens and how it connects to what we were talking about today, it's all about Darkseid and the anti-life equation. But the problem is the anti-life equation gets corrupted, and instead of doing whatever the anti-life equation does, it turns people into zombies. And so it sounds really dumb. Okay. And it should be really dumb, but it isn't. Tom Taylor takes this zombie narrative throughout the course of the DC universe. And if you've heard us talk about Tom Taylor before, you know that he's one of those writers that just gets what makes characters work. And because it's sort of an Elseworld style tale, he's not bound by continuity. So, characters are constantly dying. You're seeing relationships like the Ollie Queen, Dinah Lance relationship, the way that it should be. They followed up Deceased with, there was an Unkillable series. There was a Hope at World's End, which is an online only thing. And then Dead Planet wrapped the series up last year. The whole thing from start to finish, Tom Taylor's the writer throughout. It's really solid, really great DC action. But it's somebody who's picking up those seeds that Jack Kirby planted with the New Gods and the anti-life equation, and following it up with a really entertaining story, when it has no right to be so.
All right, and then we got our out of left field from JA.
So my out of left field pick is a bit out of left field, and I had a look online. Some of it is available in trade. Most of it is not, so guaranteed to be in the buck bins, though. And this came out of sort of the idea that we were talking about, where Kirby just threw all this stuff at the wall to see what would stick. Instead of sort of a more natural progression to things, I'm going to recommend the Kree Skrull War, but not the original, which you can find in trade, which is the Avengers, and has been pointed out doesn't actually have a lot of war in it. No, I'm going to recommend the second Kree Skrull War, which ran in Silver Surfer, starting in issue 2, declared war in issue 6, exploded in issue 25, and concluded in issue 31 of Volume 3 Silver Surfer. So this is the 80s, 90s Silver Surfer. And what I love about it is just what I said. It starts in issue 2. There's like one page where they give some inklings about, the Krees and the Skrulls not getting along and something happening and palace intrigue. And then in issue 6, there's an attack on an outpost somewhere that Silver Surfer happens to be near, and you get that for a page or two, and then you're back to the main story of that issue. And this happens on and on and on, increasingly becoming more important to the storyline until you hit issue 25, and then it is the story. And from issue 25 to issue 31, it's just Silver Surfer and what's going on with Kree-Skrull War. And this is after the Skrulls have lost their shape-shifting ability, and they're fighting the Krees. And the Krees, you've got this whole idea of the pink Kree versus the blue Kree, and it's a great storyline. Unfortunately, has not been collected mostly in trades. You can get the first 14 issues in a trade, but after that, you're going to have to go to buck bins. It's from issue 15 to issue 31. That's Ron Lim came on the book, so you get the original Ron Lim pencils. So that's some really good art. This led up to, and then Thanos Returns and Infinity Gauntlet get the introduction of Nova, Firelord's in it. In Between Earth, Galactus, I think Super Skrull shows up. Just some really good cosmic storylines that have come together naturally. And it feels like the build-up worked, as opposed to just throwing it all at the wall and then having some insurance salesmen fight out in the back alleys.
Right. And plus, I think in that particular run, too, you get Silver Surfer doing battle with folks like Grandmaster and like the Elders of the Universe.
Yeah, he goes up against the Elders of the Universe. You get Mantis comes and goes. A lot of people die, now that I think about it. Silver Surfer is not so gleaming in this. He comes out a beaten man, which is nice because that builds up then to sort of his epic failure in Infinity Gauntlet.
Yes, and it's much better than New Gods because having a surfboard in outer space versus ski poles
makes sense.
Makes
ski
more
poles
sense.
Not so much.
Right. This is the
it
big
looks
thing.
Cool. Yeah, if you're catching a wave, a cosmic wave, it's a lot better than cross country skiing across the cosmos.
Get your skis shined up. Stick a juicy fruit.
Now, if he was skiing on one ski.
That was wider.
If it looked more like a surfboard, it would be...
No, you totally didn't get my... He's skiing on one ski!
Better off dead, yeah.
I haven't seen that one.
Years. Classic. French fries. French dressing.
Well, one thing that's not French very much is our website, www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com. It's a terrific place where you can find links to all the places where you can rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast weekly. That includes places like Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Podcasts, iHeartRadio, CastBox, and a variety of other places. And if you love our show, help us out with a review, because we really love to hear from our fans and how much our show helps them find those comic books that will give them hours and hours of quality reading time.
Okay, and you can also find us on social media if you want to continue that conversation. You can find links, obviously, on our website, but on Twitter and Instagram, we are at Last Comic Shop. On Facebook, we are at Last Comic Shop Podcast.
And also on our website, you'll find links to our merch store, where this week we've got specials on purple and green t-shirts, so you can be your favorite Jack Kirby villain.
It's true. There were so many of them. Well, I thought you were going to talk about our fantastic skis. Last Comic Shop skis. Make sure that you get around the cosmos in style.
All right, and while we may be the Last Comic Shop podcast, there are probably plenty of comic shops still around near you, which you can find at www.comicshoplocator.com, where you can go find that shop. And then maybe they'll have buck bins with Silver Surfer issues with the second Kree-Skrull War. Maybe they'll have Double Dinosaur. Maybe they'll have Deceased. Or maybe you can find a nice Jack Kirby collection and appreciate all there is to appreciate in the New Gods.
It's true. And until next time, I was the host of the most daily Larson. I was joined by Chad Smith and J.A. Scott. And as always, stay safe, stay sheltered. And if you happen to find that one math book that includes the anti-life equation, throw it away. I don't even know why they would have printed that. Anti-life, that just sounds bad.
Unless you're an insurance salesman, in which case, save it because you never know when you need it for your gang.
There you go, Intergang. You could have anti-life specials, anti-life discounts, anti-life insurance.
Make sure you bundle your anti-life
with your car insurance,
with boat insurance and ski insurance.
Yeah, no, it was weird.
The Last Comic Shop was a 2021 Black Angus production.